Hello, my name is Horrorama, and today I have found 4 strange encounters people have had with multiple strange beings within both the deep woods and also quite strangely closer to civilization. Before I begin my narrations, however, I wanted to ask you to consider liking and subscribing to my channel, as that really does help a lot. But without any further ado, let's get into the encounters. The first story has been posted by a throwaway account. This happened when I was 15 near Algonquin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I always was so amazed at the beauty of Algonquin Park and Muskoka, and had grown up enjoying the beauty of it every summer. Our cottage was on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. There were probably thousands of cottages on the lake. During the summer, the lake and the town's population tripled. It was cottage county, so people would spend all summer enjoying the lake and warm nights around campfires with family and friends. I spent every summer there, growing up, and it still brings fond memories of sunshine and laughter and the sound of motorboats on the lake. But the winters were different. The people that didn't live there all year round would venture back to their cities, leaving the area mostly deserted, with cottages boarded up for the winter. There were a few people that still frequently would come up every couple of months for a few days or so, but for the most part, the lake was silent during the winter, and the town was just filled with locals. The beautiful pine trees are always covered with snow, making the forest quiet. Our cottage was on a dead-end road. There were about 20 other cottages on that road, with ours being somewhat in the middle. The cottages were quite spaced out, however, with our closest neighbors being too far away to see through the trees. My dad had needed to head up to the cottage to do some painting that my mom had been bugging him to do. It was at the end of February, and it was a long weekend, so I tagged along so he wouldn't be alone and we could spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive from our home, but turned out to be an 8-hour drive due to the heavy snow. It had gotten dark out quite early, and it was around midnight as we drove through Algonquin Park. It was deathly quiet and pitch black, except for the headlights of the car. We finally passed through the park, with only about 30 minutes left to get to the cottage. It had stopped snowing, and we were both eager to get there. As we turned onto the familiar road, I remember my dad cursing that it hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising, however. It probably wouldn't be until later the next day that we would even see a snowplow. As we drove down the road, I noticed that there was a fresh set of tire tracks. The Smiths must be up for the weekend, my dad said. All of a sudden, as we drove around the bend, following the tire tracks, the headlights of the car shone on a white van that was parked on the side of the road. It was almost hidden by the vast trees that were covered with snow. "What the?" my dad mumbled. As we drove past the white van, I remember looking back through the back window and very clearly seeing 2 figures in the front seat, illuminated by our rear tail lights. I told my dad about this, and he shrugged. Maybe they're lost. I nodded, but I couldn't help to think about how it was a dead-end road and why they would feel the need to park there. As we pulled into our driveway and we started bringing our stuff in, I could not shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about that van and why it was there, with two people just sitting in the dark in the middle of the night. It spooked me so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him, instead of sleeping downstairs in the room my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds that looked out into the blackness of the forest, and my 15-year-old self was already scared of the dark, even without seeing that van. It wasn't a big deal when my sister was there, but not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned all the lights off, and I was just using a small lamp next to the couch to try and get through one last chapter before bed. It was so quiet, I could almost hear my own ears ringing. I also started to get the feeling that I was being watched. The living room had large windows, also with no curtains, that overlooked the lake, and it was black except for a light or two from cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now that the cottage was dark, the moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was beautiful, and I walked towards the window to get a better look. Movement caught my eye, and I remember my heart dropping as I saw two figures down by the black porch. Below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I dropped to the floor and crawled towards the bedroom where my dad was sleeping. My heart in my throat. I wasn't sure if they had seen me or not. I woke my dad up, and by the time he got to the window, the two figures were gone. Where I had seen the figures, two sets of footprints in the snow led back around to the front of the cottage and back down the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He double-checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare anyone off. My dad wasn't as freaked out as I was, but still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I remember being terrified, and I laid there all night next to my dad, scared that I'd look out the window and see someone staring back at me. The next morning, my dad went outside and confirmed that there were two sets of footprints leading from the road to in behind our cottage, and then back around to the front of the cottage and back up to the road. There were tire marks that showed the vehicle had turned around and then gone back up to the main road. My dad guessed that they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff, as it was the middle of winter and not too many people were up at the lake. But they knew that we were there. They would have seen our tire tracks leading to our cottage and my dad's car parked out front. They also may have seen the lamp I had turned on to read, and or seen it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to that, and after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently there had been some break-ins in the area, and some stuff had been stolen from some cottages that were boarded up for the winter. But again, I still wonder to this day, why would they be interested in stealing from a house that clearly has people inside it? The second story has been posted by user mhop99. My story involves myself and three of my really good friends throughout my whole childhood. I will have them go by Kevin, Ryan, and Tommy, whom I am good friends with to this day. I could not write this story to you without their help, consent, and experience as well. The story you are about to hear is true and not made up in any way. Regardless whether we had been seeing things or not, the reality is we had experienced something very horrifying the one night at my friend Kevin's cabin. We thought long and hard about actually sharing it or not, afraid of being ridiculed. But we are ready to share with the community, and again, you had to be there to experience it truly. One of my friends actually suffered a nervous breakdown after the incident and needed counseling in itself. Regardless, I would like you to also know I have always been a skeptic on the paranormal and find it very hard to believe in many aspects. But I love to watch, listen, and read on it simply because I always love to have an open mind in life. An open mind, in my opinion, is a growing one. Whether it was paranormal or not, someone was clearly there that night. Now, finally on with the story. During the midsummer, usually around the middle of July, me and a couple of my good friends, who I had mentioned all the way through my childhood, always made time to go up to one of my friends' family's cabins way up north in the forests of Minnesota. Throughout all of our young years, we would always go, for sure accompanied by my friend's dad, Kevin's dad who owned the cabin, and sometimes a few other of our friends' dads as well. Once we were juniors in high school, we felt mature and old enough to go to the cabin on our own, finally, without Kevin's dad or any other adult supervision that would have maybe accompanied us. I would like to mention a little information in regards to my friend's cabin to help you picture this scenario. My friend's cabin is very remote and very little, based upon a very large sized island. The other cabins were on the island, but the next ones closest to us were a solid half-mile away at least, which you could get to by taking a man-made path around the island. And I also want to mention that to get to my friend's cabin, you had to park on a gravel road on the opposite side of this island, and then take a boat across a lake. And I also wanted to mention that this lake was massive. My mind always had a tendency to run around when sleeping there at night throughout all of my years. It was all one level, with only two bedrooms next to one another, a kitchen living room area connected to a bathroom in the back of the cabin. An area where you slept in the cabin was always at least one window in each room with no curtains, so it was very easy to see outside to the woods and to the lake. And this is where my mind would wander, as I always thought someone or something was looking inside. Of course, nobody ever was. I had been to this cabin a dozen times throughout my life, and nothing had ever happened, and the older I got, the easier it was to sleep. Now, on to the event. We would usually stay about a week or 4 nights. On the third night of the trip, when we were finally alone there, we had set up a campfire and had been drinking beer all night. We went out to this dock to gaze up at the magnificence of the stars and enjoy our buzz, when all of a sudden we heard something out at the water that sounded like a fish jumping out to catch a bug. We quickly looked out at the lake with curiosity, wondering where the splash came from, having our poles ready 24/7. Thankfully, the moon was out that night, which helped a lot to light up the lake. Otherwise, it would be pitch black. My one friend, Ryan, began to point out, saying, what is that? After looking closely and finally spotting what he was pointing at, all I can describe it as was it simply looked like a head out in the middle of the lake, just floating and staring at us directly. It was about a football field away from us. There is no question that I could see its features. It had long black hair and a very pale face. I couldn't make out the eyes though, or really any of its features, as it was just a blob of pale white skin with long black hair over it. I'll never forget the feeling that came over me. The hairs on the back of my neck and arms all stood up, and I was paralyzed with fear. But we did try to tell ourselves that it was just some sort of rock, or maybe a log floating through the water with some seaweed on it. But it was a bit difficult to believe this. All of us having the creeps and noticing it, that it wasn't moving even a little bit, just sort of staying there in the same place. We all decided to go back to our campfire and light it even brighter and head inside to drink some more. We soon forgot about the head with the help of a bit of alcohol until I had to use the bathroom really badly, and the only one inside was occupied. I just went outside to do my business since, well, we were in the great outdoors. When I was out there and I was glancing out at the beautiful moon and the lake, I noticed that the object was still there, but roughly 30 yards closer now, still looking as if it was staring right at me. But this time, I could easily see the nose on this thing's face. Again, it was a very pale face, like it hadn't seen the sun for years. Suddenly, a very, very uneasy feeling came over me, and I immediately went inside and told my other friends to come look, keeping my eyes glued to it at the door to the cabin. We all came outside to see it still there, still staring at us, as if this head was corked up at us with its chin in the air. Nobody dared to go down to the dock anymore, and we immediately went back inside, ruling out that it probably wasn't a log, because we doubted that a log would still be roughly in the same spot. Eventually, the current should have made it drift off, or at least, even if it stays in the same spot, it should have been rocking in the water. For a log to stay in the same spot for almost an hour or two made no sense to any of us. This head-like object was stiff as a board and not moving a single muscle, just staring up at us from the deck instead. There was no ripple effect at all in the lake either. We said that, again, it's probably just a log, but we all knew that we didn't really believe that. A few hours would pass, and it was very late in the night, and at this point, we knew we had to sleep. But, being my curious self, I looked back outside once more, and the object had completely vanished. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, thinking that this log must have floated off or just hit the shore somewhere. As we slept with the windows open that night, there was no AC in this cabin, and we had to open them, or we would basically fry with it being the middle of the summer and all. Me and my other buddy, Tommy, slept in the living room, while my two other friends slept in the two separate bedrooms with their doors open. Not being able to sleep, but keeping my eyes peeled shut, I began to hear someone walking around at the bottom of the stairs to the cabin, somewhere near our campfire. I immediately felt extremely nervous. I had no idea who that was or what they were doing, as I was able to hear them pacing back and forth right in front of the cabin, and I was even able to hear the sound of boots on wood, which made me even more uneasy. This whole ordeal lasted for about 3 minutes. Wanting to alarm my buddy, but frozen in fear, I just kept my eyes shut and ears on full alert. The footsteps sounded like they took 2 steps up the deck stairs all of a sudden, but then turned around and sounded like they were sprinting out down the man-made path. After that, it sounded like the steps were long gone, and a couple minutes passed, and I had woken up Tommy, asking if he had heard the steps. Both of us sitting up, when suddenly I was startled by my friend Ryan walking out of his room and saying that we need to leave. He must have heard us talking, so he felt that he should come out as well, and apparently he had also heard these steps. Something was very disturbing about his expression, and I asked him why. He told me that he had woken up my friend Kevin in the other room and told us both to go and to get to the boat. Still asking him why, he explained to us quickly while grabbing his stuff, and I will never forget what he told us. He said that while he was turning around in his bed to get more comfortable, he saw someone peeking in at the top right corner of his window, and as soon as he saw it, it quickly shifted out of his view. He said that all he saw was one eye, ghostly white skin, and black hair long down the window. Again, another thing I would like to add is that when we look back at the experience, it chills us to the bone realizing that this face was in the top right corner of the window. This thing was either damn near 8 feet tall, or it was standing on something, or maybe even worse, it was floating. Ryan then continued to scream at us to keep going, absolutely disturbed and scared out of my mind. I felt like I was going to be sick, but I still decided to tell my friends about what I had heard. And as we were running off and exiting the cabin to lock it, we noticed bare footprints in the dirt outside of the cabin. This made us even more scared and panicked, so we just booked to the boat and threw all of our stuff in and just rode off. My eyes were glued to the island, trying to spot anything moving, but thankfully I saw nothing. When we had finally gotten our stuff packed in the car and the boat tied up, we hopped in the car and took off. We had been driving out about 10 miles, and out of the blue, Ryan, he was the guy who saw the person outside of his windows, broke down and started sobbing. He was asking us about what he had seen. He was extremely panicked, to say the least. We called our parents and told them what had happened on the way back, and that Ryan was freaking out, and they told us to just get home safely and quickly. It was about 4 or 5 in the morning, but no one slept, and it was a very quiet ride home. My friend's dad, the one who owns the cabin, went up that following weekend and said that he experienced nothing there. But he did mention that the bare footprints we saw were still lingering about, which he thought was odd, because that meant someone was walking around his property, which bugged him badly. Whatever Ryan saw in that window really hit him hard. After his breakdown, he had trouble sleeping multiple nights in a row and ended up having to seek professional help for a couple of months, and he even had to use sleeping medicine. As time went on, he ended up being somewhat fine, but he still isn't comfortable while sleeping next to a window without a curtain. I, to this day, cannot explain what happened and why it only happened to us, and I cannot explain what I saw in the lake and what Ryan saw looking at him. Nothing has ever happened at that cabin since that night, or at least that's what my friend's dad tells us. I personally have never decided to go back to the cabin, which really does make me sad because I had great childhood memories there. Tommy and Kevin both have gone back and have been fine, but Ryan refuses to go back. And to be honest, I'm fully with him. A lot of people have cabins on this island, so it could have been a prank in the makings that had been busted when Ryan saw the person staring at the window, or the person possibly wanting to do something worse. I will never be able to explain what that floating in the lake thing was, but the fact this instant, along with the bare feet and someone looking at Ryan, all happened in the same night, seems like a little more than a coincidence. The third story has been posed by user neon underscore persnickety. When my mother was a child, she lived with my grandmother in a place full of woods. There were more woods than houses. You couldn't even call it a street or a neighborhood. It was more of a reserved area where the houses were well away from each other. And there were so many trees and tall bushes that at night everything was pitch black. My mother had a dog, Toby. One night, my mother and my grandmother were at home, as usual, and they heard a strange noise in the woods outside. They both thought that whatever this was just Toby. So, my grandma went to see what he was doing, and when she went to scold Toby for messing with the woods, she saw Toby's head come up and look at her. But he lifted his head so high that my grandma was able to see the back of something. She described what she saw as a person walking on all fours with their feet and hands touching the ground, but covered in black fur and a dog head. Before returning home, running, she noticed the real Toby, scared to death inside of his doghouse. Days later, Toby started to get sick. He didn't eat properly anymore and would not leave the house. He was so scared to leave the house that he would poop inside. My mother was only 11 years old at the time, and she went into despair when he started to go blind, just out of nowhere. His fur also started to fall out, and he got sick inside his own little house, and unfortunately died later that year. The same thing happened to a neighbor's dog, but he did not die. He was temporarily blind. Now, with the chickens from another neighbor, it was completely different. Think about it. If you kill a single chicken, won't the whole coop make noise? Especially if you open their bellies. Well, that's not what happened. Each of the chickens were plucked from the coop and had their bellies brutally ripped open without making a sound. My mom and I were talking about that time, and she told me that the thing probably tried to mimic Toby's appearance, and that the blindness was a way for it to stun the prey it was going to eat. These may seem like incoherent theories, but she researched the supposed skinwalker as a predatory animal and has come to the conclusion that these might be its hunting tactics. The fourth story has been posted by user H.R. Otloff. When I was a young adult, I saw something terrifying in the countryside in Denmark. A good mate and I was about to go from his place to my place when we spotted something in the edge of a forest. It was a tall figure, about 2 meters or maybe even more. Long skinny arms and legs. It didn't do anything, just stared at me and my buddy for some time and then retreated into the forest. A couple of weeks later, my sister and her boyfriend saw the same thing, not far from where I saw it. They were taking our dog for an evening walk, and suddenly, this thing appeared about 30 meters from them, again, just staring. The dog began to whimper and flee with its tail behind its legs. Then they both ran home and locked the doors. About a week later, we found a mutilated deer on our farm. The abdomen was torn and ripped open, and the guts were all over the place. The biggest predators we have in this part of the country are foxes and badgers, and I seriously doubt they could attack and do something like that to an adult deer. Shortly after, my entire family moved to another farm and a semi-large town. I myself am living in this same town now, but I swear, sometimes I have a strange feeling that I can still see it in the dark. Such strange occurrences seemingly happen every single day, and that does make me wonder how many of these events are created by the human mind tricking itself into seeing the dark and mysterious in completely ordinary circumstances. Anyone who has spent a prolonged amount of time in solitude and darkness knows for a fact that your mind starts to play tricks on you scarily quickly. Could that perhaps be the reason behind all of these strange encounters? Perhaps. Or maybe not. No one can truly know for sure. But either way, I do hope you enjoyed my narrations. And even if you didn't, I do want to wish you a good rest of your day.